leg is one of those strange expressions in show business, and that's what happens when one rising star gets to climb over the back of a aging dancer. So that's basically the story of 42nd Street and Showgirls. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hi there.
And the thing that, I feel like it's going to be really a core part of today's discussion is this idea that, like, we talked before about cult classics and stuff and how something becomes that. And I feel like the opposite of that, or something kind of at least related, is this idea that sometimes, you have like some real stinkers, like kind of just some bombs and stuff. And, I guess for some reason they still like manage to like kind of, attract, like a cult classic to me, like it's not just a bomb that kind of becomes popular. There's something that kind of, really makes it, attract an audience. But I feel like there's something about these other movies though that, like, they're just kind of almost like dogs or something like that, like kind of, which again will be another thing we'll be talking about today's episode. So, what to you like kind of really makes a bad movie, and then like kind of why is it that sometimes that still like attracts people,
Yeah, I think it's a case of how much of a particular sort of message is being sort of portrayed. And it may be kind of done, in a way that's way too over the top, or it just sort of seems very, very wrong. But then I think it's kind of like a real consistency from the director's vision. If you get that thing, and it's almost like if you go all the way in one direction, you might just make it to cult status. If you kind of go halfway and it's sort of like a half-board decision plot line, and it's been sort of metered out, but there's a few interesting things. That's almost destined to fail. So it's really this sort of uncompromising vision that may or may not completely kind of go against the current trends. So I think that's really it. Is a level of intensity, we'll say.
And it's certainly not anything to do with budget. Certainly not to do with even like I think having stars and all that. That's what I think is interesting. Like to me, like I'm kind of reminded of like when we talk about Black Christmas, that like the most recent one where like kind of it had a decent budget, even had a decent production studio backing out. Like Blumhouse is now known for horror and stuff like that. But yet, like, I don't think that it's going to, like nobody's, I feel like, is going to look back on it and kind of go, wow, like kind of, there's all these kind of things that like people are just discovering now. I mean, it just, it's not going to, I believe anyways, it's not going to have a cult following. It's not even going to be really, remembered other than that, like it was a remake and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's certainly got a kind of a quite extreme level of sort of weird idiocy to it, the Black Christmas remake, but it doesn't have this weird, you need some sort of weird off-kilter intensity, some sort of the crazy kind of chaotic factor in order to make a real cult classic, I think. Normally with some sort of performance that is so out there that you can't help but kind of get drawn into it. When you look at, I don't know, yeah, even, I think sort of I would say Flash Gordon is kind of like another kind of movie that's bad, but also quite good because it has some really sort of weirdly intense visual stuff and some performances that are completely over the top, but it's all kind of holds together. And of course it's got a great soundtrack and stuff. But, and that's a good example, I think. And even Battle Beyond the Stars is another good sort of sci-fi example that again, the performances in that are just sort of, they really veer way over the top, like John Saxon and I can't remember the name of it now, but the Valkyrie performance is just,
Sybil Danning, yeah.
Sybil Danning, yeah. So those are pretty good examples, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, campy is, I guess, one of those kind of words that like seems to just be attached to some of those kind of movies and stuff. And I guess, like, I know normally we talk about the original first and stuff, but I feel like today we kind of almost have to talk about this remake, like, or, more or less an unofficial remake and stuff of Showgirls. Yeah. And it's, here's a movie that like won, like Razzies and stuff. And I think Paul Verhoeven is one of the few directors who showed up to collect his Razzie. I mean, it's like almost unheard of right there. So I think that in itself is like kind of very much a statement about him. And he was, like very much, like we watched the You Don't Know Me documentary, and he was like, just more than just kind of happy. Like he was really into the spirit of it and stuff. And I feel like that almost is a really telling statement of, how he feels about this, this movie that kind of has been just really panned and like kind of, just really just scored by the critics and stuff.
Well, I think European filmmakers are perhaps a little bit more honest about the process of films and how they end up. I mean, I watched Werner Herzog's masterclass, and he said that practically all of his movies, he had no real idea how they would actually turn out whilst he was making it. It was only really when it was the end. And then, of course, you're so invested in the whole process that you can't even really view it objectively, even at that point. It's only when other people start watching it, you even kind of get some gauge of what this is really about and how people are going to sort of receive it. And it's weird. I think like any other creative thing, sometimes when you're painting or drawing, you don't always really know what the end product is going to be like. And I think Showgirls is definitely one of those. I think he had a particular sort of vision in his head of how he wanted it. And I'm not convinced it was a satire. I mean, I think there are satirical parts to maybe the story, but I don't think but it's the performances that people have the most problem with. And I think that's the bit that I think he just went in a direction, and that's how it turned out, and be it good or bad.
I think, like certainly for more discussions, with RoboCop and Total Recall, here's a director who doesn't do things like by accident. I mean, he's very intentional about his stuff, and so with I think like you said, with the over the top performances, it's clear that he chose to do that. Almost like knowing that like it is so bad and stuff like that. And here's the thing for me personally, like I have to admit that like, when I watched it finally, like this is a movie that like I've always had in the back of my mind on my radar, and just like kind of just kept putting off seeing it stuff. So it's kind of was really interesting for us to, like kind of look at it this, this time and stuff. And I thought that like, in my mind, like the impression was like, okay, really bad movie with a lot of sex and kind of, some violence and stuff like that. And it just seemed like, okay, like maybe something when, like some evening when I'm interested in something titillating, I'll watch it and everything. And sitting down watching it, I found that like it was comical stuff, and it was not at all like kind of, what I imagined though, that like I thought, it just, after a certain point, the amount of like, boobs in your face, and I guess I should cap for tonight. Like we're gonna be talking about a lot of different things, and it's gonna be definitely beyond our normal PG-13 rating, I think. So viewer discretion advised, all that kind of stuff. And with that said, one of the lines of that like really struck me was like, must be nice, or like kind of must be kind of something like kind of to not to become have come on you or stuff like that. Like that line itself, like really like it's like I feel like my reaction to that was like kind of probably like what a lot of people's reaction to the movie overall is like, did I really just hear that? Like,
I know, right? Yeah, I mean, as they said in the documentary, he's a provocateur, Paul Verhoeven, and he will constantly try and sort of push the boundaries. And I think he just did that. I mean, almost every line of dialogue within a 10-second sort of window has some sort of vulgarity or cursing or whatever in it. It's just the constant stream of it throughout the whole movie, which is mostly hilarious, I would say. But also he's just sort of, I mean, in a very simple way, it's just like, just sort of saying the adult entertainment industry is a pretty ugly place. I'm going to show you it all, warts and all, I guess. Right. I mean, I would say when I first watched this, which was in 1995, I was already a big fan of Paul Verhoeven. So anything he came out with, I was like, right, I'm going to go and watch that straight away. Right. And me and my friends were just like, yeah, definitely. Anything that he puts out, we're going to go and watch. And I mean, we were just absolutely cracking up at Showgirls. We just thought this was just one of the funniest things we'd ever seen. And we didn't really know if it was supposed to be funny or not, but but then again, I mean, I find David Lynch films pretty funny as well.
Mm,
I mean, I think a lot of people think they're incredibly serious art house movies,
right.
and I guess they are to some degree. You know, movies can be multiple things, but they're also
Sure.
incredibly funny if you just sort of take a step back at various points. But yeah, watching it this time, I actually started, I guess because there's just more consciousness of sort of Me Too and various other things. I started viewing it as like, you know, is he actually trying to sort of, what is he actually trying to say with Nomi's character? And I tried to take it a bit more seriously. I couldn't take it completely seriously, though. It's still far too funny for that. But yeah, it was definitely an interesting watch this time around. Much more mixed bag, I would say.
And I think what's to me like kind of is a really meta kind of aspect of it all is that here we have a movie about, you know, exploiting people and stuff, right? And how sex a lot of times is just something that's exploited. I almost feel like Paul Verhoeven exploited this actress who, you know, like kind of was known for like playing like kind of, you know, this kind of comedy, afternoon comedy, stuff like that. And just basically like, you know, just realized that like, you know, he could bring out like this kind of over the top performance slash, you know, just really just something that kind of was just where she would be like kind of really doing it in earnest and like kind of, you know, pouring her heart out and stuff, but knowing all the time that like, you know, that he was doing it for laughs and stuff. I mean, you know, I don't know, like what I'm kind of.
I don't think he was doing it for laughs. I'm not convinced. I think him and Joe saw the success of Basic Instinct that sort of played with this idea of we're going to show the American audience, you know, sexuality in a way they hadn't seen before, and kind of, you know, giving it a kind of a dangerous edge. And I think they just basically went out of their way to try and do something really extreme and over the top, so that you know, it just sort of really they just tried to push the thing there with what could be tasteful or not. But you're right in terms of what he does with Elizabeth Berkly, because there's this weird sort of crossing over of real life and the actual movie itself, in that she's known for a particular character, and he asked her to play against type, and there's also this naivety to Nomi's character. You know, she's sort of like a Pollyanna kind of character, or you know, she's obviously been through some sort of weird, rough kind of experience, but she goes into all of this stuff knowing exactly where she's, you know, what she's in for. You know, just like we as the audience, when we're watching it, we kind of know what we're in for as well.
I thought I knew what I was in for, but this definitely went way beyond like kind of, you know, what I thought initially and stuff like that, and not in the way of sex.
Yeah, sorry.
You know, I'm just saying like that. You know, I definitely went into with certain expectations and stuff. You know, like again, like kind of that it was going to be a, you know, an NC-17 movie, stuff like that, but it just kind of still in the end was just like. I don't know, like kind of, you know, David Lynch is probably like good analogy that like in some ways I felt like, you know, this was like if David Lynch made a chorus, you know, kind of musical and stuff like that, it'd be probably something pretty close to what Showgirls became.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking, well, okay, I was saying about how, you know, Elizabeth Berkly went into this kind of quite, you know, knowing what she was in for, and I was saying we're kind of in the same boat as the audience, and then you were saying actually that you didn't know what we were in for when you watched it. So yeah.
Well, what I meant by that is I thought I knew what I was going in for. That like, you know, that was again just a, you know, like kind of an NC-17 movie, lots of sex and, you know, kind of, you know, that kind of thing, stuff like that. But you know, I have to admit though that like, you know, just the fact that how we've looked at it and our discussion and everything, that it's a kind of weird, a lot of weird dynamics going on. And one of the things that, you know, you and I have kind of talked a little bit offline is that like that on the one hand, you know, Paul Verhoeven clearly wanted to kind of do something provocative with, you know, kind of showing Americans sex like they had never seen it before. But meanwhile, Elizabeth Berkly, you know, really saw this as an opportunity to kind of like take her dancing and, you know, her career in another direction from, say, from the, you know, By the Bell, which ultimately, I mean, just, you know, not only did that like kind of not happen, I think it's like kind of, I think it's kind of what's additionally interesting is that like now years, you know, like however many years, like over 20 years later of this film and stuff, it's like now like she shows up to these like showings and everything, and she's given standing ovations. It's like kind of, you know, so I think that kind of this, you know, I think that's overall what's really compelling to me about it is like kind of that, like, you know, something that what seems like on the surface just this NC-17 film that kind of bombed and like, you know, is kind of really panned and stuff like that, but now like kind of there's this second life to it, I guess is probably another way to put it.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's weird. You have this sort of dual kind of tragedy in that there's Nomi's character in the movie obviously goes through a fairly rough time and is exploited and sort of taken on this journey and ends up pretty much where she starts.
Right.
And Elizabeth Berkly also kind of just goes from this opportunity of a lifetime that just completely backfires. And I think part of the appeal of this movie, actually, in a way, or revisiting it, is this idea of like, you know, the effect it had on her as a career. And I mean, even now when she's talking about it, there's not water under the bridge when you look at her expression.
Right.
And she talks about it, understandably so as well. I mean, because she's very talented. You know, I mean, I think if I was a sort of a Quentin Tarantino style director, one of the first people I would hire would be getting Elizabeth Berkly in something, just to sort of see her in something.
Right.
She's obviously completely fearless in terms of acting to do a role like Showgirls. But also, yeah, I mean, it is this interesting question of, you know, was Paul Verhoeven actually exploiting Elizabeth Berkly during this movie? Yeah, and I mean, it's this question of how much, when you have this perceived power of a director who's had a series of very big commercial hits, that influence is, I think her trust was, she was probably trusted his vision completely, and it may not, it obviously didn't pan out for her the way she wanted it to, but I think it kind of shows you that complete kind of trust that actors would have in a director. And I think that, you know, there's also the question, I mean, you watch the documentary and he's there, all the dance sequences, which seem so laughable now because they're so exaggerated and violent, you know, all of this kind of stuff. And, you know, he's specifically going through those dance sequences saying, yeah, we want it really violent, really like this, and it's going to be really sexy. You know, this is Paul Verhoeven's, I think this is just basically a very extreme version of what Paul Verhoeven thinks of as sexy when we're watching Showgirls. And you know, I thought it was quite interesting that basically all of his movies have some kind of, you know, assault on women, sexual assault scene in all of his movies. It's, you know, it does raise this question of how much do directors get off on this stuff? Because I have a friend of mine, he worked on set with Bernardo Bertolucci's Stealing Beauty from 1995. And there's a scene where Rachel Weisz and another guy are having sex. And when that scene had cut, Bernardo Bertolucci went next door and jerked off. And it's absolutely honest to God's truth of what happened on the set. And it makes you sort of wonder, like, why is it that Luc Besson keeps making the same kind of movie over and over again with the same kind of protagonist? Yeah, you know. And so I you know, it's weird. You wonder how much of this actually veers into the world of fetish. And I guess you just, you know, it's good that Paul Verhoeven at least doesn't take himself too seriously and will turn up to the Razzies, but maybe this is just him sort of accepting that this is like part of who I am and, you know, take it or leave it, more or less. And I mean, but you can also see it on another angle, not to sort of trying to go on this labor this point, but you can also just say that, you know, maybe he just feels that there is a certain, you know, the general sort of aggressiveness and violence of Nomi's sort of character. He kind of feels that like life intrinsically has a sort of level of pain as well as love that's intrinsic to it or something like that. It's, yeah,
I guess, you know, like to me, you know, like the whole thing about like kind of showing Americans, you know, sex like they've never seen it before. I mean, you know, it absolutely is true in the sense of we're like, I don't know, like for some reason, I guess that like we tend to like rate, you know, like the general American standards and stuff is that we tend to rate, you know, sex like where it tends to get the R or the X rating much faster or stuff like that if you show any kind of sex and everything. Whereas for the violence, we're like kind of like now the things that like are PG-13 compared to like years ago. I mean, it just like we're just I don't know. I feel like we've kind of swung. And what's interesting is we're going to get into the discussion of 42nd Street, which is pre-code, where things were like kind of anything. It was like the Wild West for filmmaking in terms of standards and stuff. And then of course we had the code, which like then really like kind of tightened things up and like kind of and this was even many years before ratings and stuff. And so. And then, meanwhile, like kind of somewhere during the 70s, right, we started having X-rated movies and stuff, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is that like it's interesting how much like that we tend to almost separate sex and violence and stuff, other than of course the rape scenes and stuff like that. And then I feel like what he really did in this movie was kind of just really just mesh it together, like you were kind of pointing out about the dance routines and stuff. And then, for me, I think that was the part most surprising, that like that I expected something to kind of be like something, like kind of, sexy or kind of, titillating stuff. But it just, I felt like there was a lot of that violence that came across that then I felt like it got to the point that was so in your face and so like kind of like it felt like kind of like just like kind of this pounding like, rhythm to it that you just kind of just, like, other than the laughing and the humor and stuff like that, it just is very numbing, I guess, in the ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's relentless, the whole sort of movie, and it's not only the sort of sex stuff; it's the kind of hyped up drama as well. It's like, I mean, my favorite scene is probably actually when she first gets there at when she arrives in Vegas, because she turns up and she gets she gets the lift. She then threatens this guy immediately with a switchblade.
Right.
So you got that happening, and then he steers her over the, he's like sort of diverting traffic. She then's winning big in the casino, then losing it all in the casino.
Right.
And then her bag gets stolen, and she's like hitting a car, and then she's vomiting. And then she's, going and staying with somebody's house, and that's like all in the space of about 3 minutes or something. I mean, it's just, and that's kind of like the whole movie is just like that. It's like there's so much sort of vomiting and vulgarity and sex and everything else, just like relentlessly sort of like hitting you all the way through the movie. And it just gets to a point where you're just like, you can't. It's so hyper real that you just can't really take it seriously. And I think that's when we talk about camp. It's purposefully unnaturalistic filmmaking. And depending on how the filmmaker does that, people either like it or it becomes a cult, or people see it as very sort of arty, and it really just depends on how you do it, But I mean, that's the real sort of point with that, how you would define a camp movie, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, like this goes back again to the point that like, I definitely do believe that like, Paul Verhoeven is somebody who's going to be intentional about a lot of different things and stuff. Like one of the key scenes for me was the conversation, like a really weird one. They're in the restaurant after, kind of basically, they were doing a rehearsal and they kind of, interrupted because like, this was, Nomi's tired and stuff like that. And Gina Gershon, who she's like, I feel like, and that's the other thing that we'll get more into is like kind of the other actors in the film and how they respond, stuff like that. Gina Gershon, like kind of when she's in that moment having this conversation about doggie chow and stuff like that, it's striking because of how like that. I mean, she's like, she's not laying it thick, but it's really good acting, like in the sense of like where there's this kind of like where there's no irony to it, stuff. Yeah. Whereas you as an audience go, again, like the response is like, am I really hearing this? Like two women are talking about, enjoying doggy chow and stuff, and they're sharing a moment doing it and stuff like that. And then, like the thing that's the film or the documentary pointed out was like that Paul Verhoeven, like, does a camera thing where he's, basically like flips what was up to that moment, like kind of, the traditional filmmaking thing where like you have the protagonist on the right and stuff. And then, he flips it to show like kind of that, like that they really are the same in different ways and stuff, which is something that like, it's not real, secret, like kind of it's clear that like different points in the movie and the dialogue is like that we were meant to see that like how much parallel there is between this rising star and this kind of aging actress and stuff.
Yeah, no, it's a really weird scene. I mean, it's the lack of irony is what's so strange about it. I mean, they don't even laugh at it themselves, and it's almost like some weird bonding moment between them.
Right.
And I mean, it's one of those things that really throws you, because you just think, are they just talking about this to just sort of generally just be provocative, or is there some other meaning to this?
Right.
It's like, like you're supposed to sort of identify that Crystal Connors was at one time, down and out in Las Vegas, just as Nomi is. Yeah, it's a strange one. I mean, I think the whole, I mean, it reminds me a lot in a way of Mulholland Drive, because of this kind of hyper-real, stylized story of women in the entertainment industry sort of being exploited or having their sort of dreams shattered. And it has also a kind of very, but I mean, totally different stylistically, kind of explicit, kind of raw quality. And also it's unintentionally funny, I think, or maybe it is intentionally funny. It's very hard to tell. I mean, it's nightmarish and comedic in the same sort of way that Showgirls is. I mean, it's almost like if you could liken it to a sort of a hyper-real narcotic experience. Mulholland Drive is sort of like a thriller on horse tranquilizers, and Showgirls is more like an ayahuasca trip. There's a lot more sort of intensity and vomiting all the way through. Not that I've done that, but from what I've read anyway, but in the same way, they're both kind of hyper real and sort of weirdly dreamlike in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing that like really, if nothing else, Paul Verhoeven really achieved that is this kind of dreamlike quality to it that and even if it is a bad dream or like a trip and stuff like that, I mean that part is like kind of there's no argument there. I think for me, like the post response, like like the second light that we find or touched upon, in that, going back to that documentary, it was the one gal's response where she had suffered a rape and like certainly there's the rape scene in the kind of major spoiler like in the conclusion of Showgirls and stuff. I mean, to me, like that, like her response to it, like it's kind of like really makes a statement about how like you can have something that like maybe the critics panned and like and people generally talk about how bad like kind of the acting is and this and that, but the thing is though that like the fact that like this woman went through this trauma and it helped her pull her out of her PTSD is a really also telling statement to me that like art ultimately, it's not really up to the critics, it's not even up to you and I. It's really up to whoever like is watching it and how it affects them, like for good or bad and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I found that quite interesting, that whole thing that she found it so sort of cathartic and empowering, actually, which is because that, of course, was one of the things the critics bashed, was the way that Nomi kind of gets her revenge but doesn't really do it in the end. And
right.
So, I mean...
and even some of the feminist critics, like kind of like they basically called it misogynistic, and what I mean, like kind of it's interesting how their response was that like, it's very what's called the opposite, like of empowering and all like. But meanwhile, here's this woman who like did not see it that way and stuff like that. And to me, like I give more credence to her opinion because she went through it, like not some critic and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So I think that's what's really interesting, though, is that like here's this person who like lived through the experiences and had that this movie had this effect on her, versus some kind of critic who like is basically talking about everything third person and stuff.
Yeah. And I think it also sort of lends credence to this idea that it wasn't intended as a satire. I don't think you would put a brutal rape scene in a movie that's intended to be a comedy.
Right.
So I think that's very telling of Paul Verhoeven's original intention. And also that, I mean, in that in itself is kind of like this ugly, because if I'm right in thinking it, she sort of idolizes that character, and then she gets this chance to meet him, and it just goes completely sort of sideways, which is another kind of thing, the dangers of being a fan, which is one of those sort of things I feel like in some respects is something that a lot of people suffer from these days, because we've replaced religion with culture. People are so invested in their sort of fandoms of various sort of movie franchises or celebrities or whatever, and the reality is always going to sort of be not what you expect. And in this case, it's, you know, the worst possible kind of outcome at all.
Yeah, and certainly we've talked before about, you know, Paul Verhoeven's kind of religious background and stuff, and, you know, certainly like kind of one of the key tenements of, you know, kind of Christianity is this idea, you know, thou shalt not have false idols and stuff, and you know, I mean that part is, you know, also I think kind of clear, and to me, like the other irony, you know, like kind of we talked about, you know, this meta irony of like kind of, you know, in some ways that him almost like in some ways taking advantage of Elizabeth Berkly, like the characters of the movie and stuff. But the other irony is this fact that like this movie itself has had a resurrection, like kind of, you know, that like now it's finding this audience that like, you know, where's it coming from and stuff, right? And yeah.
Shame it took longer than 3 days. That's all I can say for Elizabeth Berkly. Yeah, I mean, it's weird. I mean, talk about going back to the empowerment thing. I mean, Nomi as a character is really bizarre for me anyway, because I do feel she's obviously a strong kind of character. She doesn't suffer fools, basically anyone. And this is the weird thing, because it's in the sort of Las Vegas, you kind of have these preconceptions about it and about how the men, you know, all the men are pretty horrible in it, and they're all trying to sort of objectify and harass, or most of the sort of women in it. And you kind of, there's part of you that kind of just thinks, oh, well, that's how it is, you know. But I think in a way, if you looked at this as if this was an office setting and these people were doing the same thing, I think Nomi's exaggerated over the top, well, we call it exaggerated. I mean, I think it would be completely justified if someone treated her the same way in a working environment that wasn't in that setting, you know, she would be completely vindicated in those scenarios. So it's a very sort of interesting way of looking at that character, I think, to sort of say, you know, what if? There's also her name, which is weird. I mean, it's literally Italian for name, and she describes it as, yeah, my mother was Italian. But you just get this impression that she kind of just made this name up. Right. Or, you know, who knows what it could mean. There's also all these sort of meta meanings of like, to know her, know me, or know me, and, you know, as they point out in the documentary. But yeah, even that is sort of weird. You kind of get this strange sort of naivety, but she's still obviously very kind of aware of what's going on and isn't afraid to sort of challenge people on it, which is, she's an interesting character, I think.
And I think that's the other kind of really weird kind of contradiction is, on the one hand, she's, you know, like kind of has these kind of lights of, you know, kind of stardom in her eyes like that, but meanwhile she's supposed to be, like you said, aware and everything. And I guess, you know, people are full of contradictions, so it's like, you know, rarely do we have like kind of you know, somebody who like is as simple as kind of like you know, these older black and white movies, which I guess that's like maybe a good segue into you know, like kind of 42nd Street. So in some ways, you know, kind of that kind of cliche about like going back to a simpler time is really the case with this movie, because here we have a musical that you know, it's one of the ones that like the work of Busby Berkley is kind of really starting to get known. You know, he has this kind of ability to kind of make these kind of kaleidoscope effects with these dancers. And it just, you know, besides becoming his signature, it's just something that I think it really sets off this kind of trend, if you will, of like kind of, you know, because I think some of the other movies, I don't, you know, can't say that I know a bunch of them, stuff like that, but like, you know, where we see like these, not only the dancers, but even like the swimming sequences, right? Where like, you know, all the, what's called the performers go in this kind of perfect sequence. It's something that I think on the one hand, it's really like kind of visually dazzling and stuff like that. and the other, I feel like it's also this. It echoes like we've talked about before about how that like when we have a certain period, you know, like kind of like more recently, it's kind of with the age of software and information that we tend to talk in terms of software and stuff like that. I feel like in that age, you know, like what he was kind of portraying was this kind of industrial age that like was really starting to kind of really kick in, and
Yeah,
you know, showing people
point.
as like kind of these, you know, cogs, if you will, of this, you know, vast machine, you know, like kind of that there's this movie and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, it's really where you see this transition from people going to the stage to watch a musical, and
Right.
this is like the visual kind of change that signifies, okay, now you're going to get something different if you go to a movie and you watch a musical. And yeah, I mean, they're really interesting to watch. It's kind of like one of those things of watching, you know, something without CGI, watching, you know, stunt sequences or something, a similar sort of thing, the amount of coordination and everything else. And they're still very impressive to watch.
I was also finding out that like apparently like musicals were on the decline right up to this movie.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of a funny kind of thing, and it feels like what happened was that like they just kind of injected new life into the genre by basically saying, you know, oh, you know, like tired of, you know, the same old musical, try this, like kind of, you know, like and they definitely like kind of just brought something to it that like yeah, I mean, just, you know, probably like this idea that like something that audiences hadn't seen before and stuff, you know, like and I feel like that in a funny way echoes Paul Verhoeven's idea about sexuality and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. It's absolutely similar. And basically, what he brought with this was the prototype backstage musical. So this is the one where you got to see all the drama behind the scenes.
Right.
And so the interesting thing is, you know, you got to see all the sort of uncut raw background to how this industry works, and it sort of shots 42nd Street to the height of success. You see the same thing with the adult industry with Showgirls, and it did exactly the opposite. So it's a kind of but I mean, it's a similar kind of idea of like, you know, trying to show people, and that's what they say with a lot of these pre-code movies at that time, is that there's often like a kind of a voyeuristic element to them. It's just like, you know, we're kind of just going to throw this in, and, you know, so it's part of the story, but it's also part of the appeal of going to watch the movie in the first place.
Right.
I mean, there's even kind of like scenes that are very similar in that, you know, the Julian Marsh, the musical director in 42nd Street, when all the girls alone say, all right, come on, hitch your skirts up, let's see those legs. And then you have Tony Moss in Showgirls, okay, all right, I'm doing another show, let's see your tits. And, you know, it's in some respects, it's kind of similar beats. You know, you've also got Dorothy Brock, I want to say, who is she was the starlet who's sort of on the way out in the 42nd Street, who's replaced by Peggy. And you could say that's the same sort of story with Gina Gershon and Nomi.
Yeah, I mean, at its heart, that's the real kind of parallel. That's the real part that's being remade stuff. But, you know, like clearly very different reactions though, because here, like, you know, BB Daniels as Dorothy Brock is kind of like, oh, I had my time, you go on, stuff like that. But meanwhile, like, you know, Gina Gershon is going, you know, like, okay, you want this, you know, you can have it, so like that, and, you know, good luck, you know, like, you know, and it's just very much like kind of more bitter kind of attitude stuff, not such a benevolent kind of like, you know, oh, it's okay, yeah, kind of, you know, like my leg is, you know, you busted my leg, but, you know, I'll be all right, stuff. Meanwhile, like, and then the other thing too, of course, is like, again, major spoiler alert, is like, you know, like it's not some accident, like kind of with Naomi. She's like, I mean, it's full on. Like, how did no one else see this pushing this person down the stairs? You know?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, it's
a violent push.
But that's in keeping with the character. You know, she's very kind of like ambitious, and, you know, that's her thing. And everything seems to be violent. You know, with her. It's
right.
So, yeah. But I mean, they're both world-weary characters, though. Both sort of BB Daniels and Gina Gershon's character. Of course, Peggy is a very different character. She's very sort of innocent and naive, and is all sort of like dazzled by this whole sort of process.
Right, which is kind of the funny thing that we kind of have talked about with the Nomi character, that like she on the one hand seems to have that kind of like star struck kind of quality and stuff, but the other like kind of like all the over top kind of things and stuff like that shows that she's not and everything. So it's like kind of so it is really, that's one of the kind of things that's also striking about it, is that like we have like kind of this very much like kind of naive kind of innocence and stuff to 42nd Street, and it's kind of maintained through like kind of the story and stuff. She's almost at different times like like can't believe all this kind of stardom's coming to her and stuff, and and you kind of go with that. In some ways I feel like it's I'm reminded of like A Star Is Born, where
I was thinking exactly the same thing when I saw it.
Initially, like kind of in the original version of stuff, she kind of has this kind of naivety when she shows up and like kind of like just figures that like all she has to do is like kind of arrive in Hollywood and all the jobs become pouring in and stuff like that.
Well, it is that as well. I mean, that was exactly what I thought of as well when I was watching it. This is very similar to A Star Is Born, but I mean, I guess the difference we're talking about here is one is pre-code and one is after the code.
Yeah.
And actually, in a way, 42nd Street, it has much more sort of bawdy comedy. There's a lot more sort of sleaze. You see one character kind of, sleeping with the producer just to make sure she keeps her job, but she's got a man on the side, and then Peggy's kind of like after him and things like this. It's quite.
A lot going on.
A lot going on. A lot more than, it's a lot less innocent than I would say A Star Is Born, which was only 4 years later.
Right.
And that deals with some pretty intense, relationships as well in it. But the kind of general kind of sleaziness is quite a lot higher, I would say, in 42nd Street, especially with you see all the sort of the other dancers sort of attacking each other, being fairly catty to each other and stuff like that. And I'm guessing for 1933, this was probably quite sleazy. I don't think it was. It probably wasn't Showgirls, but it was probably a bit more kind of like risque than a lot of other stuff that was around at the time, I'm guessing, and probably profited off that.
And to put it into context and stuff, we're right now deep into the Depression, the Great Depression and stuff, because like this is after the stock market crash of 1929, stuff like that. The one quote that kind of struck me by Busby Berkly is that in an age of breadlines, depression, and wars, I tried to help people get away from all the misery to turn their minds to something else. I wanted to make people happy, if only for an hour. So it's you have that kind of quality to it of like these lavish kind of set pieces and the kind of the choreography, stuff like that. But meanwhile, we're seeing kind of behind the scenes, and here's the director who's on the edge of verge of going broke and stuff like that. He's on the decline. So this definitely echoes like Norman Mailer and stuff like that. Like at different points, like the show wasn't going to go on. It was going to like kind of collapse because of like because at one point when Dorothy kind of was injured and stuff, that they didn't have anybody to replace her until magically we find like kind of this rising star that kind of comes from the backwoods of Pennsylvania and stuff like that. And so you kind of had this weird kind of thing of like, on the one hand you're showing like kind of the things that like people go to get away and forget about things for a while, but meanwhile you are seeing like kind of the griminess, like I said, like the sleaziness as well.
And it makes me think of the scene with the party where you've got sort of like guys just sort of grabbing Baby Daniels, and they're being pretty obnoxious, and there's the other dancer who's trying to sort of hit on Peggy fairly blatantly. And in a way, I guess the kind of similarity with Showgirls in terms of Peggy and Nomi is that rather than it is focused around in 42nd Street, it's focused around the production, and that she comes in naive and she kind of gets embroiled into all these interrelationships that kind of end up with people being hit and various other things, and like the mob coming in and thread. So she gets sort of embroiled in this drama around the production, whereas I would say in Showgirls, it's more like Nomi getting him, you know, it's the city as the backdrop rather than the production. It her sort of like, you know, having to deal with the various sort of drama that she sort of comes into contact around, well, yeah, Las Vegas and the production. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of objectification and harassment they both have to go through as well. You know, it's but on both sides. So yeah, and it's fairly, but in a way though, I kind of feel it's similar to Showgirls in that it's trying to sort of show you all the ugly side of the adult entertainment industry. With 42nd Street, they're trying to do the same, but just with a Broadway production. And the men are kind of, you know, they're a real mixture. And you have people like Abner who are very blatantly seen as trying to exploit and objectify women. And then, you know, there's a sort of, there's the sort of the nicer characters, like Dick Powell and George Brent's characters. But, you know, still you've got Peggy. Peggy's not dumb. She's still locking the door even when he offers her a bed at that. I thought that was a really interesting sort of like scene, in that she's not completely stupid, you know? Not totally naive. So yeah, it's got a sort of a certain level of sort of self-consciousness about what it's doing with the men in that movie. Yeah,
I mean, it is kind of just this weird of like mix of like innocence and you know, not so innocent and stuff. Like you know, like one point, like she, you know, Peggy like kind of faints and stuff, and you know, like I guess, you know, that was the time when people fainted. You know, like as nowadays people would jump to the conclusion like, oh, she's on drugs. You know, right. That was just, just go, you know, like kind of just right away to be the conclusion that we would come to and stuff like that.
Maybe if you mapped fainting to vomiting in Showgirls, they would be analogous. I don't know. But yeah, yeah, and it's again, it's kind of, you know, is she going to get exploited at that moment as well? Yeah, and of course, I guess we've got to mention this is one of the earliest, if not the first, role for Ginger Rogers.
Yeah, we have
standout.
Yeah.
And it was she's a very memorable kind of comedic turn in this, and no dancing, which is really strange. So.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what's fascinating different times, right? When you see an actor that like, and there's no sign of like kind of what they have coming, you know, for them and stuff like that. We kind of, you know, came into that with Regina King, which I guess might as well announce that, like, you know, we've got Watchmen coming up and stuff like that. And she, like, you know, I've never mind kind of, you know, seeing her in Mighty Joe Young and stuff, but also I've seen her for years in Big Bang Theory, and just it's just no sign of like kind of what she's going to become. And I think that's very much what we have here with Ginger Rogers, that like, you know, she's doing the numbers and stuff, but she's just very much a chorus girl. And in fact, what's the even more ironic part is she's giving the lead, you know, like kind of like she passes on the lead to Peggy and stuff.
Well, this is, I don't know, I think that's kind of like some weird statement on the morality or how it was viewed at the time, because she's Anytime Annie, right, who only said no once, right, which is part of our sort of comic persona. Yeah. But I think there's sort of this underlying thing of she's probably not innocent and pure enough, or as innocent as Peggy, so Peggy kind of deserves it because she's sort of morally better or something like that. I think there may be some kind of subtext of that in why she just so, you know, willingly hands over the lead role, because that really doesn't make any sense, you know, unless they're trying to kind of make some point like that.
Yeah, I mean, it almost in a way feels like that, despite the fact that we're pre-code, and that like this kind of little bit of lawlessness and stuff, because you have like kind of, you know, like you have the flapper girls, like kind of that this is kind of awakening to kind of, you know, after, you know, women's lib and stuff like that. This is kind of like women kind of starting to assert themselves and stuff like that. That despite all that, a good girl, if you will, is still like, you know, Peggy, and in fact, you know, good girls get like kind of the prize in the end and stuff. I feel like that's still the morality that like is still the underlying, you know, current and stuff.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think a lot of stuff got recut so that, you know, women did anything vaguely sort of, you know, manipulative or exploitative, they go to jail or get killed by the end of it or something. Maybe over the top, but yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things that I find sort of kind of interesting about 42nd Street is the fact that you actually see them dancing badly. You know, this is like one of
Right.
the rare times in a Hollywood movie where you see
Yeah.
people practicing and they're not like absolutely perfect. Because that,
Right.
by the time you get to the 40s, you never see anyone dancing badly
No.
in a
Yeah.
musical, or them practicing. Or so again, it has that kind of like, you know, interesting backstage kind of pass to viewing it. But yeah.
Yeah, I kind of curious, like what kind of inspired, I guess, like because I think maybe part of it is that like just that overall idea that like like we're gonna show like kind of this musical slash show business like it's never been seen and stuff like that. I think that's one key intention and stuff. But the other is like kind of it is such a kind of unusual movie for just like all these kind of things we talked about, like kind of showing grittiness and kind of polish and
I think it's purely the voyeuristic angle. I think it's kind of like someone was backstage at a Broadway, probably Busby Berkley or, the guy who wrote it and stuff, and just thought, there's all these girls you get to, when you're backstage, you get to see girls fair, semi-undressed,
right.
and I'm sure it's just something like that. Basically, they thought, oh yeah, this will go down well. So
I guess yeah, it was their equivalent of like kind of titillation, I guess, in the 1930s and stuff.
Yeah, totally. Well, they could get away with, right? What they could market. Yeah.
Any last thoughts about kind of as we kind of
oh well, I mean, there was quite a few things in 42nd Street I thought was pretty funny. I mean, the song "I'm Young and Healthy" was like, well, kind of how bad do things have to be when the point of a song is just that you're healthy? So that's good enough to fall in love and have a relationship. He's like, you look great and I'm healthy. Let's make a go of it. It was just kind of, doesn't take much, obviously, in the 1930s.
Yeah, I think we have to keep in mind that these are people that, like, why they're so, desperate to kind of hold on to the jobs. Like the fact that they're healthy and all that is the fact that, like, they have a job. Like, because I feel like, going back to King Kong, ironically, kind of like that where Peter Jackson actually chose to show that aspect of the depression that, you have red lines, you have, people that like, they're just wanting to kind of get an apple, like kind of, as we saw and stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, again, that also had this, I don't know who she was, but the blonde in that, the way she sort of multiplies, which is quite interesting, sort of visually,
right.
I thought was pretty cool. So yeah, and of course there's the main song, those dancing feet on 42nd Street, which is a very catchy song, There's no surprise that it, became a hit with that. But I mean, the way they portray 42nd Street is really sort of funny for me, in that you've got kind of like slightly sort of the people of varying physical proportions sort of on display, kind of P.T. Barnum-like. Right. You got people drunk. There's a kind of a rape and a murder.
Yeah,
it's all happening on 42nd Street, and it's kind of celebrated in a way that's like, hey, crazy 42nd Street.
Yeah, and for years though, kind of, having been around New York, like in the 70s, like kind of degree, I mean, that was very much 42nd Street, like kind of the whole justification didn't happen till like Giuliani came along and stuff like that. Many years later, like in the 90s, thereabouts and stuff, where they cleaned things up and you put a Disney store, because up to then it was very much, especially in the 70s, it was like triple X theaters and like kind of like all the exploitation movies and stuff. That was 42nd Street. Besides of course the drugs and the the rapes and all the other kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, they're not, and I guess that's kind of that sort of underpins this whole sort of movie. Really, they're trying to kind of show you a bit of the seedier side of both, well, in a meta way in the production, but basically in the background stage production. The other thing I really enjoyed, but just from a technical perspective, because you realize it, is when they do that long sort of panning out shot at the end. The camera's kind of wobbling all over the place, and you think, wow, yeah. Steadicam made a huge difference to those kind of shots. And then I loved it when the curtains come down and it just has asbestos as like the sort of sponsor. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that.
That's a great point though too, because like apparently asbestos had nowhere near the meaning back then and stuff. I mean, that was what people were used to and stuff like that. So it's so funny now, like like looking back.
Yeah, that I just really sort of enjoyed that. Yeah, aside from that, I mean, it's again, it's a bit like I always find it weird watching these movies from the 30s and the 40s, and that they have very short running times. But again, it's so dialogue based and so sort of set based that they feel so much longer.
Yeah.
And of course, they don't have people sort of hitting each other and vomiting everywhere, so it doesn't. It seems to sort of go slower. But yeah, I think that I pretty enjoyed it actually. It was quite entertaining. 42nd Street.
Yeah,
It still stands up pretty well.
it's funny to kind of like watch some of these that like you just kind of always knew were kind of classics and stuff, and for me like it's now I can kind of really see like kind of why different times, you know, like kind of it is like one of those kind of musicals that really just there's something about it like kind of that then, you know, like kind of ultimately it became a Broadway classic, you know, like kind of like 42nd Street for a number of years was just played over and over. I mean, you know, like I want to say like thousands of performances. So in other words,
Yeah,
it's funny how like, and that's something we kind of like almost touched on where there's, I guess last year they had a, they filmed it and stuff like that. So that's the most latest movie iteration of the story and everything. So
yeah, on Broadway. Yeah.
right.
No. I think definitely Showgirls captures some of that kind of idea and just goes in a slightly different direction with it. But then, you know,
just a little bit, just a little
so,
bit.
I mean, obviously 42nd Street, Hollywood classic. Showgirls, Hollywood classic as well, would you say?
Well, you know, like it's definitely risen like a phoenix, you know, kind of like having this kind of new life and stuff like that. So I tell you that like it'll be interesting kind of going forward years from now that like
Yeah.
what happens like kind of, you know, like because you know, like we kind of alluded to the kind of the religious reference. I wonder if like, you know, like you're going to have like kind of more and more like of these showings and these celebrations and stuff, right? Like never mind the parody that one girl was in and stuff like that. That then like another case in point, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, right? Like that was a movie that like now is like kind of religiously watched by people who know the lines that they kind of throw, you know, toast and, you know, on and on. And I wonder if like Showgirls is going to have a similar kind of, you know, I guess almost like religious ceremony or celebration of it and stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. I mean, it already seems to be happening.
Right.
But you're right in the sort of the religion sort of way, in a way that, you know, like Rocky Horror and the way they have these sort of almost ceremonial showings of it.
Right.
You know, they're obviously very sort of cathartic and, you know, in some sort of sexual context that people want to go and sort of, they hold these up as examples of, you know, you see what life would be like if you lived like Nomi. If every time sort of someone tried to get your attention, you told them to, you know, F off.
Fuck off.
Yeah, you know, and you know, it's like, yeah, so it's, yeah, there's definitely something sort of compelling and sort of liberating, I would guess, about watching these kind of movies. So I'm sure that's what people are just sort of tacking onto and celebrating.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how. Yeah, I mean, I guess you just have to look at all the movies that were less like most reviled and see how they, you know, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I guess.
Yeah, that's
you know,
true.
that's another one on a different sort of tack. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I enjoyed it when I watched it in 1995 and thought it was absolutely hilarious. Didn't take it seriously at all, and now kind of, you know, you can see it both ways. You can see it as a wannabe serious thriller that goes off the rails, or you can see it as a, you know, hilarious thing, or you can see it as a sort of an empowering, hyper real kind of dream story. It's funny and it works on several different levels, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that's, you know, like kind of definitely, you know, going back to the idea that like art ultimately is something you just send out into the world, and, you know, like kind of what life it takes after that, it's totally on its own, like kind of, you know, it's between the audience and what you've made and stuff.
Yeah, and it's funny. It seems like the more uncompromising your vision, the more that I think further down the line, you know, time-wise, you may end up way ahead of your time, or you may, you know, I mean, RoboCop was, you know, very ahead of its time. Total Recall, I don't know. We'll see. I think Total Recall, when we start getting into more virtual reality and, you know, possible tampering with our own memories, who knows? That may be much more sort of have a lot more sort of foresight than we once gave it credit for. So yeah, interesting stuff anyway.
Definitely. And as mentioned, coming up we'll have a look at Watchmen, between the original movie and the series on HBO that's kind of been developed. And yeah, definitely looking forward to that discussion, as we kind of talked about. I'm trying to think of what's the other ones that we have next.
Well, we've got Brave New World. We can get that at some stage.
Yes.
I think we've pretty much finished with Paul Verhoeven for a while.
Yeah.
Until they remake Basic Instinct or something.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and I think that was the main ones we were going to do coming up.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.